Hello and welcome to our October Break the Norm Leadership Lunch and Learn. Before we introduce our facilitators today, I would like to thank Charles Irvin and the Southern Maryland PMI for sponsoring our event today. While our monthly Lunch and Learn events are complimentary, we would appreciate the chance to engage in a meaningful conversation with you or your organization's representatives of how Break the Norm leadership services can assist in fulfilling your business development requirements. For further information, please feel free to reach out to Rachel at breakthenormleadership.com. A few different announcements. November 14th at noon is our next Lunch and Learn, so make sure and save the date, and we'll be talking about influencing without authority. And then to sign up for our monthly newsletter on our website, breakthenormleadership.com. And then in February, we will commence our pilot run of the Organizational Development Certificate Program. So you can also see additional information and details on our website at breakthenormleadership.com/OD. So I would like to introduce our facilitator and our guest today. Dr. Ramian R. Pierre is a highly experienced educator transitioning from middle school teaching to administrative roles at schools like Haverford College. He later managed professional development at the Kennedy Center and NASA with degrees from Brown, Harvard, and George Washington University. He now directs leadership development at the Executive Leadership Council, focused on advancing Black professionals into Fortune 1000 C-suite roles. Ramian, an introvert and Virgo, resides in Baltimore with his husband, the other Mr. Pierre. Ramian is currently recovering from a double kidney transplant surgery and enjoys indulging in extensive streaming experiences. Caitlin Ertzman, our guest speaker, is a seasoned change management communication consultant with ICF, a leading strategic consulting firm in Washington, D.C., with over 5 years of experience in communication, change management, org development across both the public and private sector. She specializes in crafting communication strategies and plans, guiding introductions of new initiatives, and fostering organizational culture. Caitlin is known for her collaboration with senior leaders, driving comprehensive communication plans, and for her proficiency in facilitating strategic communication brainstorming sessions and hosting training workshops, contributing to her impressive track record of success. Please welcome Dr. Ramian Pierre and Caitlin Ertzman on the Leadership Lunch and Learn panel.
Thank you so much, Rachel. My name is Ramian Pierre, Dr. Ramian Pierre, but please call me Ramian. We are taking questions. We're going to do a Q&A. So if you have a question at any point, please drop it into the chat so that we can get back to you. And very excited to be talking to the PMI of Southern Maryland. It's nice to have other Marylanders online for once. So today we're talking about effective communication. I have an amazing guest with us today, Caitlin Ertzman. She's a change management consultant as well as a communication expert. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Excited to dive in on this topic.
Awesome. And before we dive into your considerable wisdom and mine your wisdom, I want to take a moment to explain two things. First, my attire. Second, the title of the session. So as Rachel mentioned, I received a kidney transplant earlier this summer, so I'm wearing comfortable gear. I'm wearing my blue comfort onesie today. I didn't want to impress you with my power red onesie, but please don't take offense to my casual attire. Second, I want to explain the title of this session, and I just want to tell you the story about the real life incident that inspired today's session. So I was part of a 3-person team doing a virtual presentation to a potential client. We were looking to get business. So there were real dollars on the table. And before the presentation happened, the review panel gave us 5 questions that they wanted my team to answer. We were delivering a training program through a virtual platform that we customized for that client. So we had the 5 questions, we put together our presentation, we practiced, we were ready to go. The day of the presentation, we start by introducing ourselves, just as Rachel, Caitlin, and I just did a moment ago, And then we immediately went into the technical capabilities of the platform that we'd be using to deliver the program. Probably about 10 minutes after that, so a total of 15 minutes into the presentation, one of the panelists reviewing us said, so have you started your presentation yet? Or like, and then she just sort of trailed off. You can imagine my feelings at the time. I went through all the stages of miscommunication grief. First I went through denial. Like there was a what? Like how is somebody possibly asking this question? Then of course I went through panic, thinking, all right, maybe it's not just her, maybe all the panelists are confused that we actually started this presentation 15 minutes ago. Are we going too fast? Are we going too slow? And then I got defensive. I got the third stage, and I began to make up stories in my head. You know, maybe this panelist was multitasking, wasn't paying attention. But I was definitely blaming her and not taking responsibility for the lack of communication, the disconnect. And I stayed in that defensive stance probably for a good chunk of the presentation. We did get through it. And afterwards, I began to really think. I began to think, why did I stay in defensiveness? Why didn't I address the issue? And to be honest, the reason why is because I have a considerable history of training people on how to be effective communicators. I've done coaching, I've led workshops. I felt really embarrassed that I got it wrong, that I didn't make the message clear right up front. Now, yes, we were a team giving that presentation, but I took responsibility because as part of the team, we all fail, we all succeed. So I decided I need to figure out how to get through this defensiveness. And that's where I got to the other 2 stages of the 5 stages of miscommunicator grief. I got to reevaluation. First, I thought, all right, what could I have done differently, or what could we have done differently? My first thought was, you know, they were looking for those 5 questions. We should have answered those in the first 2 minutes before we went on to the technical capabilities of our platform. And then I finally got to stage 5, which is acceptance and adaptation. And what I decided to do was to go back to basics, to look at all these materials I had developed or learned or taken or borrowed about how to be an effective communicator, about how to give an effective presentation. And I tried my best to get down to what I think might be called first order principles of communication. Although now that I say that out loud, it sounds very Star Wars-y, first order. So maybe think mother sauces, the mother sauces of effective communication. And we came up with 6. Rachel and I, the Break the Norm leadership team, we came up with 6 different first order-ish principles of communication that we're going to share with you today. So that was the story. This was a real incident that inspired today's session. And now I want to bring Caitlin into the conversation, because as a communication expert, we can't rely just on me. I just want to pull in her wisdom. And again, if at any point as we go through these 6 principles and the discussion, if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat so that we can answer them when we get to the Q&A period. All right, so Caitlin, I'm going to bring you into the conversation, all right?
Yes.
Awesome. So let's do the bad communication stuff first. And I told my story, but I don't think I'm alone in terms of getting something wrong when trying to give a clear, coherent message during a presentation. In your experience, what are some of the things that people tend to get wrong when they're trying to communicate well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first thing that always comes to mind for me is when we present, when we communicate, we're thinking about ourselves. We're thinking about how to get our message across, how to get our opinion across, but really all about effective communication, it's about the listener and the audience. And so we need to reframe and really think, what are they looking to learn from this? What do they care about? What are their priorities? And really put ourselves in their shoes in order to be able to effectively communicate to them. And that's going to depend on who your audience is. So it really is, every time you communicate, you need to kind of go through those steps. And then the other thing that comes to mind a lot for what we get wrong about communication is we don't communicate enough. So often we think, okay, we say it once, they should get it, they heard it. You know, maybe we even said it twice, they should really get it. But in this day and age, with all of just the information overload and all of the messaging we're getting, you really need to communicate multiple times. In the communication world, we always say 7 times in 7 different ways, which is a lot. That can be too much, but kind of using that principle when you're thinking about am I saying this in a couple different ways? Am I using different channels to get my point across and things like that? So I think those are kind of the two things that come to mind when thinking about what we get wrong.
I really love that, particularly Caitlin, the 7 times in 7 different ways. Just before I started becoming a full-time teacher when I was in graduate school, I remember the first hour of the first class, we had our professor write on the chalkboard. That tells you how long ago I was in school. There was actually a chalkboard. He wrote on the board 3 times 3 equals 2. And right below that, he wrote 7 times 1 equals 0. And I was no math major, but I knew that didn't make any sense. And he used that as to start the conversation to say, if you communicate something 3 times in 3 different ways, people are likely to remember, students, pardon, are likely to remember 2 of them. If you say 7 things just once in 1 different way, they're probably not going to remember anything 0. And I would argue that many 12-year-olds, which is what I was being trained to teach, are not quite so different from corporate professionals who are busy and distracted. Like they want the bottom line up front. They want a clear, coherent message. Now, admittedly, corporate professionals won't tell you if you wear the same pants twice in 1 week. Leave that for middle school students, but arguably they're the same. So I really like that comment about the 7 times 7. What are some of the different ways that people might be able to give a message instead of just saying literally the same words in the same way 7 different times? Can you give us some hints?
Yeah, I think for sure. So I think kind of thinking about different channels. So if it is a live presentation, maybe it's sharing the slides on your screen as well, or maybe it's sending the slides before or after, right? So thinking of different channels. And a lot of the work we do, we're designing, communication strategies and campaigns. So we're thinking through, is there an all hands where I could talk about this? Is there an email? Is there a newsletter? Is there a team site? And just thinking about all the different ways you can kind of get to people and diversifying that, because, people like to receive communication in different ways as well.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's keep going. During my story that I shared just a moment ago about how 15 minutes into my presentation, someone asked, have you started yet? I mentioned how I went through the 5 stages of miscommunicator grief. It's something that we at Break the Norm Leadership have come up with to help me manage my feelings and make sense of that experience. So the 5 stages are, stage number 1 is denial. Stage number 2 is panic. Stage number 3 is defensiveness. And in my story, I stayed in defensiveness for a long time. And then stages 4 are reevaluation, and you end up in stage 5, which is eventually acceptance and adaptation, where you change your methods. From your experience, how does your experience align with this idea that communicators go through different stages of grief when they miscommunicate or when there's some sort of communication challenge?
Yeah, I really like this idea. I had never heard of it, spelled out in this way, but when you had said that, it really resonated with me. And I think it's interesting because it depends on the type of communication. And so for you, for example, you're presenting live and you're going through all of this while you have an audience, right? Whereas, something that happened to me recently, I got some feedback on this large email that we were drafting and a lot of very specific feedback, but I was able to go through these stages kind of privately. So at first denial was like, no, this can't be true. I panicked, of course, got defensive, was saying they don't know what they're talking about. They're not a communications person, but then I was able to do the reevaluation and the acceptance before sending an updated draft back. So that was really kind of valuable to be able to process it by yourself, work through all of it to be able to send a new product. Whereas it can be a totally different experience if you're presenting live, as you know.
Clearly, yes. But thank you for walking through that process, how you did that with an email, because I have many a time sent an email out way too fast before I realized, I should have, I usually get back responses that I don't expect. And that starts me on this process. That makes sense. So I got stuck in defensiveness, but I'm curious what you think or what you've seen with other people. In your opinion, is there a particular stage that most communicators get stuck in when they miscommunicate?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't think you're alone in getting stuck in defensiveness. I think that is kind of where we resort to, especially if we have an identity caught up in being an effective communicator, if that's how we see ourselves, if that's how other people have told us in the past, like you're a great communicator. I think it's really easy to get stuck in defensiveness and think, the audience doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm right here. I'm just not communicating to the right group of people, yada, yada, yada. But I think this really goes back to, what we were talking about earlier and really understanding your audience and empathizing with them before you communicate, to kind of get rid of that defensiveness, because you've done what you need to do to connect with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. It also sounds like as communicators, we need to, or communication initiators, we need to take responsibility for the whole experience, from like the message coming out to the message coming back, or the feedback about the message coming back. Because if I had taken responsibility for this woman's reaction instead of blaming her, I might have gotten through that defensive period a little bit faster, right?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. But it can be hard, as we all know, to do that live as well. So I think being able to prepare for that before you go into that presentation, kind of, understand your triggers of defensiveness before you go in, and kind of do some examination before will hopefully alleviate that situation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so let's get into these first order-ish principles of communication. So literally what I did during my acceptance and adaptation phase is I gathered materials, I made lists of all the things that I knew were good for communication. Whether it's making a presentation, whether it's sending an email, whether it's doing things live. And I tried to figure out what are the common themes. And we came up with 6 of them. And I'll go through them just one at a time. And I have questions for you around each one of these, Caitlin. So number 1 has to do with intent and goal. And principle number 1 is know your core intent, the core intent of the message. And I had the advantage in my story. I didn't use it, but I had the advantage that this evaluation group had sent us the 5 questions. I knew what they wanted. Like they wanted us to show that we could do the job, and by answering these 5 questions. But because of I made our technical platform more important. I want to make sure I explained all the details, all the bells and whistles. I sort of breezed over what the core intent should have been and was just trying to get my message across. So here's the question, Caitlin, is for presenters like me, what might they do to, 1, get clear about their message, and 2, which is just as important and probably more important, once they're clear about their message, to stay on that message no matter what other shiny squirrels might distract them from the core message?
Yeah, I think it's all in the preparation. So it's really taking the time up front. And this is what I do. I ask myself, what are the top 3 to 5 things that this audience cares about and that I need to communicate to them before this is over? And then use those kind of high-level topics to really build your key messages around them. And that becomes the meat of your presentation, right? You can have supporting evidence and, other things to say, but if it's not related to one of those 3 to 5 key messages, you need to think about, does it really belong? So that's kind of how I do all of my communications. And then as you're presenting, right, you just need to keep reminding yourself, which key message does this relate to? Let me bring it back to the key messages and keep it moving that way.
Oh, I really like that. I love that you're starting the communication planning process with questions as opposed to answers. Because so often, corporate professionals, nonprofit professionals, just professionals we're validated by what answers we can provide, not by what questions we can ask, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a really good way to kind of put yourself in the audience perspective too, by asking yourself, questions about what they might care about and things like that. So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I would imagine those questions sort of put you in a learner mindset to figure out what it is they need, as opposed to a giver mindset of they're going to take whatever I give them.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's go to the second principle. Principle number 2 is to be clear. If it's not clear, then it hasn't been communicated. And I think an apt metaphor for this is water. Like communication should be as clear as water, refreshing, without any sort of impurities, like just a pure message. But so often, I and other communicators get in the habit of adding jargon or making things overly complicated or just lacking focus. And our audiences end up literally being thirsty for understanding, to stick with the metaphor. Or there's another way you could say this, like there's that parable, like if a tree falls in the woods. So the communication version of that would be, if a person communicates in the woods, but no one is there to hear it, have they really even communicated at all? So here is the question I have for you is, what do you think, just based on your experience working with communication and communicators, what do you think is the reason or reasons why so many of us fall into this trap of unclear communication?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think there's kind of two things that come to my mind. So the first one, I think sometimes we overcompensate with overcomplicating our message. So perhaps we're nervous that our point's not going to get across. We're nervous of not appearing as an expert or not appearing knowledgeable. And in order to kind of overcompensate, we throw in overcomplications. We use a lot of jargon to show that we fit in and that we know what we're talking about. And really, at the end of the day, that's just kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. So I would say the advice there is just like trust in yourself, prepare, go in confident, and trust that you know your stuff. But I think the other reason could be as well, if we really are an expert on a topic and it's something we're really passionate about, we want to communicate everything we possibly can to our listener because we just want them to know everything. And if they're starting from, a baseline of not knowing much about that topic, it's very easy to overwhelm them, overcomplicate what we're saying when we really just should be sticking with, the clear key messages like we talked about before.
Yeah, and actually Kevin talked about this in the chat, that pace and overwhelming the keeping your pace even, don't overwhelm the receiver. I can definitely see myself and others getting so excited that we want to get everything all out all at once. I can also, if I do like a root cause analysis of that impulse, I think it boils down to, I feel like this is my one chance to talk to these folks and they will never talk to me ever again. So let me give them everything from A to Z. But maybe if I looked at this, whatever this is, this presentation, this email, this blog post, as the beginning of a conversation instead of the beginning and end, maybe I wouldn't put so much pressure on myself to try and squeeze 10 pounds of flour into a 5-pound bag, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think that's exactly right. I think, and if you do a really good job of communicating kind of that first part in that, then that invites people to come again and to get into the conversation. Whereas if you're overcomplicating, sharing way too much, you're pretty much guaranteeing that they're not coming back.
Fair. All right, let's go to principle number 3, and that is know what your audience needs. Now, in my story, I had the benefit of they literally told me, answer these 5 questions. But what if I'm a presenter and I haven't gotten questions in advance? Maybe I just got a topic. Do you have advice about how presenters might, in real time or before presentation, identify what their audience needs so that they can figure out what information to share?
Yeah, I think it's kind of going back to what we've been talking about before, but really just trying to be as empathetic and really putting yourself in their situation. I think one way to do this is kind of the idea of using personas. So if you know that there are a couple of different types of people in the group, maybe it's, people from this industry as well as this group and this group, really thinking through, okay, what does the typical person in this industry care about? Why might they be coming to my presentation? What are they looking to learn from this? So I think kind of back to what we were saying, it's a lot of asking questions and trying to really understand, who's here, what do they care about, what do they value, and what do they need to walk away with?
Yeah, I really like this idea of personas, and I'm definitely stealing that. As you were saying it, I realized when I teach, I often tell my students, don't write your papers to me. I'm not your audience. Because of the type of classes that I teach, I tell them your audience is a distracted and busy executive who has 10,000 things on their plate, 100 things in their email, people at their door. Write to that person. So put yourself in their shoes. But I didn't think of it as, as the idea of personas. So I really appreciate that, because I can think I would want to have one of the personas that I try and put myself into is the distracted and busy executive. Maybe another is the skeptic, the person with their arms crossed who thinks like none of what you say is going to make any difference. You're all bad. And maybe another persona is somebody who's like on the edge of their chair and who gets it completely, who's tuned in with me. And using those lenses, if I looked at my presentation, I might be able to catch things I could add or take away just to make sure I'm hitting all the people. Is that the way that you've seen people use this persona strategy before?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, for sure. And if you happen to know somebody that might kind of be close to that persona, you could always interview them as well and just kind of have a conversation about, when you're in this setting, what really captures your attention or what do you not like as well. So you can kind of think about your own network and kind of asking them for advice as well.
Oh, this makes a lot of sense. All right, let's go to principle number 4, which has to do with feedback and listening. And this is, the message here is ensure that the received message matches the intended message. And I think of this sort of like using the example of radar, that radar, submarines send out a signal and it only works if the signal comes back, right? But often I feel like I might be sending messages out into the void. I don't know where they go. I don't know who's getting them. I don't know what they're hearing. I feel like humans are really good at faking that they're paying attention. They're all looking at me, they're nodding their heads, maybe sometimes even maybe writing something down. But what advice do you have for how people might be, how presenters might get a sense of whether or not their message is being received in the way that it's intended, or so that they know whether or not their audience is engaged and on the same page as them or disconnected?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a lot about reading the room, like you said, right? And sometimes, people can kind of deceive you. I think if you are seeing people write things down and not looking at their phones, then it's a win. So I think that you can definitely go with that. But I think too, stopping along the way of your presentation, opening space for questions. Maybe you don't need to stop at every part and say, who has questions, but just kind of having a pause and inviting people to share if they wanted to. I think that can always help. I think too, just kind of looking for affirmation of saying like, are you with me? Or does that make sense? And just kind of looking out to see if there's any head nodding or any perplexed looks and kind of being able to read the room in that way.
Got it. All right. So building in sort of like, I don't know what to call them, maybe comprehension checks in your presentation might be a way, like whether that's a question or getting some feedback from the audience, or as you said, getting them to make some physical moves. That might be a way to see whether or not they're on the same page as you at any point in time.
For sure. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Let me get to principle number 5, which is about emotion and authenticity. Now, this is one that's a little bit tough for me as a Virgo, because I usually, I believe that everyone's entitled to have feelings, but I'm just not inclined to have them myself. My therapist says no one ever died from a feeling, but I'm not convinced. So here's the question for you. If emotion is important, I'm thinking of that Maya Angelou quote that people will remember how you made them feel, even if they don't remember exactly what you said. How can communicators ensure that they're conveying authentic emotion, particularly in this day and age, these after times where so much of our communication is virtual or digital, like on social media platforms? How do you convey authentic emotion when someone's not in the room with you? Is this, I guess, the bottom line question.
Yeah, I think that's really tough. And I think that can be kind of the start of conflict sometimes too, because you might be conveying one emotion and people are receiving the other emotion, perceiving you to be, maybe you put an exclamation point and people are interpreting that differently, so it can be really hard. I think for me, kind of the way I do it is if I'm ever typing something that's going to go an email or a Teams chat or social media or wherever it might be going, taking that moment to pause, to read it aloud and decide, is this accurately representing how I feel? And is this a representation of me? So if you pause, read it aloud and you're like, that doesn't sound good, right? Take a minute to rewrite it. So it's just kind of adding in those checks and balances to make sure that you really are being authentic. You are being, emotional in the right way. And you're not just quickly typing, sending and moving on.
Oh, that's a really good point. Some of my presentation role models in terms of people I've actually worked with who I thought were exceptional presenters. I realized sort of late that they both read aloud when they were practicing. I'm a sort of read silently, but I would walk by their offices and hear them talking, peek my head in, and there's no one in there but them, and they were just practicing what they were going to say. And now that you said what you just did, I'm realizing that they weren't just going over content or trying to memorize things. They were trying to figure out what's the right emotional tone, what's the right way of saying things to get the message, to get the right feeling to match the words. Which actually, now that I've said that out loud, reminds me of, that sort of, it's often misquoted research about how much of your message is conveyed versus in body language versus your tone versus the actual content of the words. The researcher on which that saying is based is Morabian. I think he's actually still a professor at UCLA. And I went back to the studies on which that he did and based the work on. And my read of them is very different from what people are commonly saying. They say that, I'm going to get the percentages wrong, 45% of the message is tone. Math is, I won't do public math, sorry. But what I read in his research is that when people can't tell, when they're unsure about your message, they will prioritize the way you look, what you're doing with your body. Then after that, they will prioritize the tone of voice before they go to the content of the words. So it's when they're not clear, it's the sort of the order of operations of what they pay attention to, body, tone, and then finally the words. So I apologize, I lost my train of thought. I'm not sure where I was going with that, but you inspired me to share.
No, I think that's super interesting. And it raises questions for me about, virtual communication and how we can, we might be skipping the body language part, but we can have tone and kind of thinking through how to best display our tone and things like that. So I think that's really relevant.
Oh yeah, okay, awesome. All right, let's go to our sixth principle, and I'll do a review of all of them. Our sixth principle is stay committed to the goal, but adapt the method. Kind of like marry the goal, but only date the method. Not even date steady. So this one is about, just making sure that when you get signals that your communication is not working, to find ways to pivot. Caitlin, I can say pivot and it sounds easy, but I'm imagining, just from my experience alone, that pivoting is not so easy to do, especially in real time. So what type of strategies or tactics have you seen communicators use in real time to change their method if they're getting feedback from their audience that what they're currently doing is not working?
Yes, this is tough. And I think it's a lot of presenters and communicators' worst fear, right? That you're up there, you're all prepared, you're ready to go, and then, it's not resonating. So I think this comes back, it's all in the preparation, right? I think you need to prepare to be able to pivot. So have a couple different things in your back pocket that you're ready to pull out. Maybe it's, switching to a different slide, or maybe it's skipping around a few things or pulling up a poll, things like that you can be ready to do if you need to. And I think too, like turning it and depending on the setting, but asking questions to the audience, right? So kind of understanding, what are you maybe not sure of, or what are you looking to learn from this? What can I do, to help you understand, or, that kind of thing to help you pivot a little bit more effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. It makes me recall an incident. I was doing a training for federal employees at a regional office in Georgia. And I can't remember the topic of the training, but maybe about 45 minutes in, I had to stop things because up to that point, I'm used to adults being a little bit passive aggressive at first. Some people come to training because they're taking a vacation from work. Some people come to training because they want to learn. Some people come to training because they're hostages. And I had a room full of hostages and I couldn't figure out why. But about 45 minutes in, I just said, let's stop. It's very clear that folks are unhappy here and this isn't quite working. I'm not sure what is going on, but can you give me some feedback about this presentation and what your expectations were? And it turns out that that's when I found out they were all hostages. Their management mandated that they all come to this training. They all felt that their managers should be the one at this training, not them. And so they were sort of taking it out on me as, coming in, overnight contractor flying out the next day. So after about 5-10 minutes of them sharing their frustrations, I said, all right, let's take a break. And when you come back, I'll have a new plan. And they went away. And I sat there panicking, went through the stages of grief for miscommunicators. I stayed in panic for a long time. And then they came back from break. I still didn't have a plan. And I asked them, what should we do? It's clear to me that you had expectation A. I came in with content Z. Like, how do we meet? Do we meet in the middle at LNM? Like, what should we do? And I was shocked by what they said. They said, no, let's go through the content as you designed it or as you were instructed to give it to us. We just had to get that out. So even though I had miscommunicated with them, we used it as an opportunity. I asked them, why is this hurting you? Show me on the miscommunication doll where I've hurt you. They expressed their feelings. I was willing to pivot, and they said, no, you don't need to pivot. Now that we have a choice, we'll stick with the sort of assigned plan. It sounds like that's a real life example that I didn't intend of what you're talking about here.
I think definitely. And I think you're showing them that you're being empathetic, right? You're putting yourself in their shoes and you want to hear from them what they want. And I think that's a great example.
Awesome. All right. I appreciate that feedback because I'm still trying to recover from this bad incident this summer. So let me do this now. And please know, everyone who's on the call right now, is that we'll be sharing these 6 first order-ish principles of communication with all of you, as well as the 5 stages of miscommunicator grief, in addition to a copy of this recording. But let me go over the 6 principles right now. So number 1, know your core intent. Know what message it is you want to get across. Like, what's the one thing that they must walk away knowing or feeling or doing? Number 2 is be clear, because if it's not clear, it hasn't been communicated. I'm going to come back to that one in a second because I realized something else I want to share. Number 3 is know what your audience needs and prioritize that, not what you want to give them, but what they want to hear. Number 4 is to close the feedback loop. Make sure that the intended message is actually the received message, by building in comprehension checks, for example, in your presentation or communication. Number 5, authentic communication is felt as much as it is understood. So it's a combination. It's not just heart, or head. It's a combination of both. And lastly, number 6, commit to the communication goal, not to the communication method. So be married to the goal, but not the method. I want to go back to number 3 about being clear, because when I was pulling together materials to identify these 6 first order-ish principles of communication, one of my favorite texts is, I'll get the exact title wrong, but it's about scientific presentations. I use this a lot when I was working with NASA engineers, and in terms of giving them advice and coaching about how to make a presentation that worked, because as many technical organizations, they are married to PowerPoint. And one of the things that I was reading in this text, because the authors did a study at the University of Chicago, and they looked at, all right, if I give a good presentation or a bad presentation or no presentation, what is the impact on the recipient's understanding of the topic? And what they found is, no surprise, if you give a good presentation, it strongly correlated with recipients understanding the material. The really interesting part was no communication or bad communication. The researchers found that if you gave no communication, recipients were more clear about your topic than if you gave bad communication, that giving a bad presentation is worse than giving no presentation at all. And that was a huge mind blown when I sort of read that research, because I realized, we really need to prioritize being effective, because being ineffective is worse and confusing and frustrating for our recipients, more so than if we never said anything to them at all. I don't know if I have a question for you, Caitlin, but I'm curious, does that resonate with your experience? as both a communicator and a communication subject matter expert?
Yes, it definitely does, right? Because we said that communication is a lot about how you're feeling and kind of the feeling you're walking away from. And I think we can all attest to sitting in a bad presentation. Maybe it's confusing, maybe the presenter is not knowledgeable, or maybe it is just very, very dry. But regardless, you walk away and you do not have a good feeling about that topic. Maybe you're even more confused than you were before, or maybe they communicated something that just wasn't quite right. And now you are just on the opposite end of understanding that topic. So I have not heard that research before, but it absolutely resonates with me.
Yeah, so I will do my best to find the actual citation so that I can share it when we share all the other materials associated with this talk today. But yeah, thank you for validating my feelings about reading that research. So we're at a really good time to take some questions. And I'm going to scroll up to the chat, but Caitlin, you have access to the chat as well. I wonder if there are questions on here that you want to dive into first before I start pulling some threads.
Yeah, I see one question that was asked by Kevin, and it says, when would you ever pivot from your intended message if feedback from your audience indicates an interest in a subject for which you did not have on your agenda? I think that is a really good question. And I think it's kind of a balance, because if you're not an expert on that topic, or that's not, your wheelhouse, I don't know that you necessarily want to go off on that topic, because as we just said, a bad presentation could be worse than no presentation at all. So I think you kind of need to think about it. Think about, am I the right person to be talking about this? And does this kind of meet the objective, depending on, if it's a meeting that you need to accomplish or things like that. I do think something that can go a long way, though, is acknowledging it and just being transparent with your audience of saying, I hear that this is what you want to talk about. Unfortunately, I'm not the subject matter expert in this, but let me go back and find somebody that is. And next time, that's what we'll talk about. So I think just kind of being upfront and open, rather than completely abandoning your agenda and getting into, that panic zone that we had talked about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's actually a great response. Can I yes and you, Caitlin?
Please.
So please ditto on everything that you said. And this question in your response reminds me of training I received many moons ago when I was a camp counselor about how do you address uncomfortable questions from campers, like where do babies come from? Because you're not a parent, you shouldn't be giving this advice necessarily, or you may not know how to answer the question. And if I were to adapt that to the situation, I might say something like this if I get a question I'm not expecting, or request for a discussion I'm not expecting from my audience. Like you said, I would admit, look, I'm not a subject matter expert on that. I am congenitally wired to answer any question that someone asks me, whether I'm an expert or not. So what I usually have learned to say is, I'm not an expert. Would you like me to make a guess? Meaning that I will do my best, but please, this is the disclaimer, verify, trust but verify. Often, or I'll say 50-50 people will say, yes, please make a guess. And then I bring in my camp counselor training where I say, well, when I think about it, I try and create bookends. I've heard this about this topic, and I try and go all the way to the other end. I've heard this about the topic. And the reason why they taught us to do that as camp counselors was to make room for wherever the person has their thinking. You don't want to just make it seem like everyone in the world thinks like this. You want to give them space by pointing out two bookends. And then you say what you believe. So I might say, if you're asking me about digital communication in a way that promotes or shows authentic emotion, I might say, well, I think this, or I've heard this, and I think this, and I've heard that, but here's where I land. Is that a technique that you think might be helpful with non-campers?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. And I really like what you said about kind of making space for wherever that person lands. I really like that idea, because you don't want to say, this is what I believe, and that's crazy, right? Because you don't know where that person's going to land on it. So I think that's a great approach.
Yeah, and to also address Kevin's question, it feels like that pivot, you want to definitely pivot from your message to acknowledge the question. If you I guess if I felt like I had to get through this content because I'm contracted or it's part of my obligation, I might say, I will do my best to answer that question at the end in Q&A or perhaps afterwards, even if I sort of was a subject matter expert but didn't have it built into my presentation at the moment. Does that make some sense? All right, Caitlin, is there another question you'd like to tackle?
I'm not seeing any other questions come in yet.
All right. Let me go through some of these comments then just to make sure. Someone asked about my attire. Yes, so normally I dress a lot more formally, but I appreciate your patience. Oh, this Charles, he talked about how audience scoping is key. Yeah, busy executives don't want down in the weeds. Give them the high level bottom line up front at the beginning and then move the technical detail to the backup section at the end of the presentation. I can't think of how many times I've had to tell people backup or background it tells you where to put it. Don't lead with all this technical stuff, like put it in the back. Put in the foreground is like the one key message you need to get across, or the key needs of your audience. But too often we get so invested in the context that we put that way too early in a presentation, or spend most of the time in the presentation presenting as opposed to presenting what we want as opposed to getting what the audience wants. And Amy, I apologize for insinuating, even for a moment, that presenters are not people. We are people, just sometimes we may not feel like people. And I like Charles again, keep it simple. Keep it simple. Keep it simply simple. Yes, I'm gonna butcher his name. There's a, what do you call someone who studies physics? Not a physician. Physicist. There's a physicist, I think his name is Richard Feynman, it's with an F. And I believe that one of his, he apparently was a physicist, he is a brilliant physicist and also a great teacher. And what he recommends, if you are a subject matter expert trying to talk to somebody else, is if you try to explain your concept, something I can't think of a concept, maybe how gravity works, something super complicated. But if you can explain it to your grandmother or to the world's smartest 12-year-old, then you have a firm grasp of it. He used it as a learning technique. You can't learn it until you can explain it to somebody else. So I like this idea of keeping it simple, both for the audience, but also for the actual communicator. If I can't say it simply, then I probably don't understand it well enough. Does that make some sense, Caitlin?
It does, and I think that goes back to our overcomplicated jargon conversation, right? So I think absolutely. Yeah.
Another trick that I've seen people use to deal with jargon is using a text-to-speech reader, because just hearing a fairly monotone, although they're much more sophisticated now, computer voice reading my speech back to me, that's when I realized, well, that doesn't make any sense. I was clearly relying on, I don't know what I was thinking. I was drunk when I wrote this. Is that that's a Prince song, right? I was drunk. Yeah. Anyway, so I've often used or heard people using speech recognition software as a way to help them understand whether or not their message is clear and simple. I'm curious, Caitlin, when you're practicing for a presentation or preparing, how do you practice? Do you have strategies or a routine?
Yeah, I'm definitely an out loud practicer. So, if you were walking by my office, you would hear me, talking to myself all day long. But that's definitely, I always try to write down notes first and things like that, which is really, that's helpful to kind of organize your thoughts. But I don't think there's any replication to actually just saying out loud. You'll see kind of where you get tripped up or where you're kind of, get lost in your thoughts and things like that. So that's definitely my preference.
That makes a lot of sense. I probably, even though I've been doing this for a while, I probably should practice that a little bit more. I'm going to admit that what I tend to do is to write out a script, literally word for word of what I'm going to say, even pauses, sometimes jokes. I didn't do all of that today. And then during the presentation, I black out and forget to look at my script, and I just talk. And often it goes really, really well, but I will admit I probably should spend a lot more time practicing what I'm going to say out loud, as opposed to just relying on my brain to go on autopilot.
Yeah, I think it kind of helps with being more comfortable in the moment too, right? Some people are just very natural and can talk off the cuff, and that works great, but not everybody is like that. So I think being able to just practice, kind of build your trust in yourself, kind of commit some of it to memory, I think that can be really useful.
All right, awesome. All right, that's all I see for questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make just one more thanks and one more announcement. In a second, Caitlin, though, to sort of sign us out, I'd love if you could come up with just like, what's one thing you want people to take away from our conversation today about effective communication, about being an effective communicator. But before Caitlin gives her response, I again want to thank our sponsors for this presentation, Southern Maryland PMI, Go Southern Maryland, and particularly Charles Irvin for helping organize and coordinate today. Thank you so much. Those of you who came onto camera, you did my heart, you filled my heart with joy, seeing your smiling faces and the thumbs up and laughing at my jokes. I appreciate that. As Rachel mentioned at the top, Break the Norm Leadership, we're doing these lunch and learns on a monthly basis. Next month on November 14th, we're talking about influencing without authority. The idea here is that, yes, you may have positional authority and people will do what you say, perhaps even just because of your gravitas, but that's not necessarily the best way to motivate people. That if you're using your authority, then you're motivated, but other people may just be compliant. So how can we move people, and sometimes even ourselves, without using harsh power, but more softer power? So we'll talk about tactics, strategies, and some frameworks for how we can make that happen. That's next month. So come back. If you like this, you'll love that. This first one's for, they're all free. Caitlin, let's go back to the question I asked you. If there's one thing you want people to leave with, what might that one thing be? And then I'll take a stab.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing is when you're thinking about communicating, just remember it's not about the communicator, it's about the audience or the listener. So I think just that idea of putting on your listener hat, putting yourself in their shoes, whether it's personas or, talking to similar people. But I think that's really what I hope everybody takes away is, to really consider your listener.
Awesome. I love that. So let's ditto. I'm going to underline, double click that. And then for me, I would say, if you ever find yourself in a miscommunication situation, either from your own doing or because the universe conspires against you, please give yourself grace as you move through the 5 stages of miscommunicator grief. You're not going to avoid any of the steps, but you can just sort of give yourself grace so you can move through them smoothly and land at adaptation and acceptance, where you can actually make changes that will help your audience. So forgive yourself. All right, we're going to end there. Thank you all so much for your time. I hope that we have earned the privilege of your time and attention today. And I hope to see some of you next month when we talk about influencing without authority on November the 14th. Until then, please take care.